Okay, we are going to solve some more radical equations. These could also be called square root equations. When I have one square root sign, I need to isolate the square root where it's on one side of the equal side by itself, and so it's all by itself on the left-hand side of the equal sign, and then I'm going to square both sides. The reason I square both sides is the square cancels out the square root because they are opposites. Because the x is squared, this is a quadratic equation. In order to solve a quadratic equation, it has to be equal to 0. So I need to add 7x to both sides and subtract the 18 from both sides to zero out this side. The factors of negative 18 are 1 and 18 and 2 and 9 and 3 and 6. And if I put the signs in this way, these could add up to a negative 7. And so these would add up, check my signs there, and so then x plus 2 equals 0, or x minus 9 equals 0, so x equals negative 2, or x equals a positive 9. And you let me make a sign mistake. Where is my sign mistake? What did I do right here with the 7? If I'm adding this 7, what kind of 7 is that right there? And so this should be a negative sign, and this should be a positive sign. And so when you change the sign from one step to another, that would give you the wrong signs in your answer. So let's try this again. Those are the corrected answers. This was adding 7x to both sides, so this should be plus 7x, and this should be minus and plus. And then when I solve them, the x would be, the 2 is positive and the 9 is negative. And when I have two answers, I need to have two checks. I need to go back to the original problem and I'm going to have to check it 2 times, one for each answer. And so I plug in each of the answers and I solve that out to see if it's true. This would be 18 minus 14. This one checks out. This 2 is a solution. This would be 18 plus 63. This would be 81. Does positive 9 equal negative 9? It's the same number, but it's not the same sign. They are not equal, and so that makes this one an extraneous answer. You can, on some of these problems, get 2 solutions. You can get 1 solution and 1 extraneous. If you got 2 extraneous answers, then that would mean there would be no solution. That happens occasionally, but not very much. So we have negative x plus 7x minus 3 equals 1. Before I can solve a square root equation, I need this square root to be by itself. It needs to be isolated. So I am going to need to add x to both sides. And that's going to cancel out the x. And then I need to square both sides so that the square root cancels out. Is that correct? What's wrong with it? When you square a binomial, what do you have to do? This side over here is x squared plus 2x plus 1. When you square a binomial, you do not just square the first term and square the second term. There is this middle term, and you can see from the box problem where the middle term comes from. Do not forget that when you have a binomial squared, you need to square it out with a box problem. Or if you've done enough box problems that you can figure it out in your head, that's okay also. I need to zero this out. This is an x squared, so I need to zero this out so that minus 5x, so that I can factor this side over here. The factors of 4 are 2 times 2 or 4 times 1. Negative 4 times negative 1 is equal to the positive 4, and when you add them together, they're equal to the negative 5. And so when I set these equal to 0 and solve them, I will get 2 answers. When I have 2 answers, I need to have 2 checks. And I skipped a step there, because when I set that equal to 0, I'm going to add 4 to both sides. And so you should be able to start skipping some of these easier steps. So the original problem was negative x plus the square root of 7x minus 3. Is that equal to 1? Minus x plus 7x minus 3 equal to 1. So in place of this x, I need a 4. And then I need a 1, because I have to check it 2 times. So this would be minus 4 plus 7 times 4 is 28. Minus 3 would be a 25. Minus 4 plus 5, is that equal to 1? Plus 7 minus 3. That one checks out also. So that means that both of these are solutions. There is no extraneous solution to this problem. Do I need to wait a minute? Okay, so if you understand square root equations, it's not a great big giant step to understand what happens with cube root equations, because we're going to use the same step. We're going to isolate the radical by itself on one side of the equal sign. And then we're going to need to cancel out the radical. But since it's got an index of 3, I'm not going to square both sides. The opposite of a cube root is a cube. Does that make sense? A square cancels out a square root, and a cube would cancel out a cube root. So the 3 cancels out the index, it cancels out the root. Now over here, let me remind you that 3 to the 3rd power means 3 times another 3 times another 3. 3 times 3 would be 9, 9 times 3 would be 27. Subtract 2 from both sides. Solve by dividing by 5. Our next kind of equation adds one more level. 2x plus 4 less than or equal to 4. What if instead of an equal sign, it's an inequality sign? What do you do? It's the same steps, except do you remember the golden rule of inequalities? When you multiply or divide by a negative, you flip the sign. When you're solving in one of your steps, if you multiply or divide by a negative, it switches the inequality sign. Other than that, it's almost the same as what we were doing. Isolate the radical, square both sides, solve. Now, this is not quadratic, so I don't have to factor. I did not use my golden rule of inequalities because I did not multiply or divide by a negative. However, there is one more part of this problem. It can be called restricting the domain, or it can be called reasonable domain. Either way, I do not want this part underneath the square root sign to be a negative. What happens if you have a negative under a square root sign? Do you remember that makes an imaginary number? I don't want an imaginary answer to this problem, so this part underneath the square root sign has to be greater than or equal to 0, so I don't get an imaginary answer. I'm going to solve this out. 2x negative 4 divide by 2 . And then I'm going to put my answers together. The answer is this and this, and a number line can help me do that. Have the number 6 and the number negative 2. Negative 6 is less than or equal to, that would make a closed-in dot. Less than goes to the left. This part at negative 2 is going to be a closed-in dot because of the or equal to, and this is going to go to the right. You talk, if it's it doesn't matter whether it's positive and negative. The closed circle goes with the or equal to. And so the or equal to makes both of those a closed circle. That means my answer has to be between negative 2 and positive 6. The x has to be between negative 2 and positive 6. And when you have a between statement, you always use the less than because it has to be in order from the smallest to the largest. And so this is my final answer. Come on. Example? When you have two radical signs, you want them on opposite sides of, in this case, the inequality. Okay, have them on opposite sides. Then I'm going to square both sides. And so that's going to give me x plus 7 . Now, another thing that I do differently than just equalities is if it is an inequality, I want the x's to end up on the left-hand side because that's going to be easier to make my number line. So I am going to subtract the 2x in order to get my x's together and on the left. So this is going to be negative 1x plus 7. I subtracted that, and that's going to be a minus 1. Then I'm going to subtract 7 from both sides to get my whole numbers together. Then I am going to divide by negative 1. That means the golden rule of inequalities is going to kick in. The golden rule of inequalities say when you multiply or divide by a negative, it switches the inequality sign. Because I divided by a negative, it changes the greater than sign to a less than sign. Also, I must check the domain or restrict the domain or get a reasonable domain. The x plus 7 has to be greater than or equal to 0 because I do not want to have a negative under the radical sign, which would give me an imaginary answer. So the x has to be greater than or equal to negative 7. Also, the other radical sign has to be greater than or equal to 0. So we have 3 parts to our answer. Let's put them all together on a number line and see what we come up with. These are all or equal to, so we have closed dots. X is less than the 8. X is greater than the 7. And x is greater than the 1/2. And so do you see when I do that it covers up the 1/2? So my answer is between negative 7 and 8. The 1/2 is included in there. X is between negative 7 and 8. And when you write a between statement, you point to the left because you always go from less than to greater than. And so that is my final answer.